1-month vacation from capitalism. You're free to eat red food, wear red accessories, or read red books, Marx's Capital, or Set the Night on Fire, Los Angeles in the 60s. And by the way, there's a Red May sale at Verso, 50% off print books, and I think it's 90% off ebooks. So definitely a bargain there. Before we get on to the main event here, I just want to tell you what's on tap for a number of our, for what's coming up anyway. Tomorrow at 5 p.m., Capital is Dead. This is Something Worse, which is also a Verso book, actually, by Mackenzie Wark. Alexander Zevin, Jasper Burns are going to respond to Mackenzie Wark's theory. And Wendy Liu is going to be the moderator on Thursday at 6 p.m. Climate Change Through a Pandemic Lens. That has Theory of Francos, Nick Estes, Holly Jean Buck, Jeff Mann, and Olufemi Taiwo is the moderator. And on Friday, 5 p.m., these are Pacific time, by the way, Racial Capitalism and Disposable Populations in the Time of COVID-19. I have to talk about money. I don't like to talk about money, but we need money. But today I feel that the money is just going to come raining down on us from who knows where. All you need to do is go to our website or even go to the description of this event. You'll see a little button that says donate, click on it, look inside your pockets and your hearts, give us what you can. A festival like ours, which has a slogan like be a commie for a month, doesn't have any institutional funding, actually. But now I'd like to introduce our moderator for the day, Magally Miranda Alcazar, who is on the editorial board of Viewpoint and is a PhD student at UCLA who studies domestic care work and the care economy. So Maga, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Phil. Philip, I'm really thankful, first of all, to Red May. I'm obviously dressed the part for Red May to turn commie for just 1 month. And I also really want to thank Sean and Mike, who are behind the scenes today, helping us out with broadcasting today, and to Julia from Verso, who's the publisher of Set the Night on Fire, for also helping us put this together. And as Philip mentioned, we're joined today by the authors of the new book, Set the Night on Fire. It's out now with Verso Books. It's an enormous book, as you can see. I'll go ahead and introduce our guests. We have Mike Davis, who in many of these parts needs no introduction, but he's an American writer, political activist, urban theorist, and historian. He's the author of many books such as City of Quartz, Excavating the Future in Los Angeles, Planet of Slums, Ecology of Fear, and many others, including my personal favorite, Magical Urbanism, Latinos Reinventing the US Big City. Also with us today is co-author John Wiener, a historian and journalist based in LA and also a professor at UC Irvine. He's been a contributing editor to The Nation since 1994, where he's written about such diverse topics as campus issues, intellectual controversies, and Southern California politics. His writings appeared in The Guardian, the New York Times Magazine, the New Republic, and the LA Times. And it's also worth noting that both of our guests today and the authors of this book, Mike and John, are not only historians of the 1960s, but in their own capacity, each of them were active participants in the social movements that they discuss in the book. This includes Mike's leadership in the Los Angeles chapter of the Students for Democratic Society, in various parts of the anti-war movement, the Southern California branch of the Communist Party for a brief stint, and then the rank and file Teamsters movement. And John was also a member of SDS, but on the East Coast, he became politicized because of the events in Mississippi, Birmingham, and Selma, and became a journalist working on these beats as well as the anti-war movement before moving to LA in 1969, where he says that, you know, at that point, there was no shortage of things to report on, including the Free Angela Davis trial and other things that we'll discuss, I hope. And I'm really personally excited because as this acclaimed sociologist Barbara Ehrenreich notes in the cover, the back cover, this is a history of the 60s written by some of many people's favorite locals. And I just wanted to start by asking if I missed anything, and asking how you two met during this period, and how did you decide to write this book together?
Book was, it's basically Mike's idea, Mike's structure. This is something he'd had in mind for a very long time. And I was just waiting for it to appear. And then, I don't know, 5 years ago or something like that, he asked me if I would co-author it, because he had several other projects underway, which often is the case with Mike. So we divided up the chapters at that point. Mike wrote what is the backbone of the book, the narrative of Black and Chicano organizing and struggle. And then I wrote about the anti-war movement, the gay movement, the women's movement, and the counterculture. And then we traded chapters back and forth. He did some revising of my chapters, thankfully. We thank you for that, Mike. And it took us a long time, and the book is much longer than it was supposed to be, but we still feel we left out some things that we still feel pretty bad about. But have I got this right, Mike?
Well, I think you attach undue importance to my contribution. But I must show you, I met John in 1968, was it?
69.
The Haymarket for that.
69 or 70, somewhere in there.
Yeah, I was involved with a movement collective that had organized a coffee house called the Haymarket, a few blocks away from LACC. And the Haymarket sponsored a showing of some Cuban films. And we've been warned that we might be attacked by the Alpha 66 people. These are the Cuban mercenaries who landed at the Bay of Pigs in 1962, John? Yes.
Close enough.
And we were all gathered there one night, but my wife was getting her teaching credential, and I went to pick her up. And when we came back, driving north on the Hollywood freeway, we could see flames 50, 60 feet in the air, and knew instantly what had happened. And the Cuban mercenaries had come in heavily armed. They had cans of oven cleaner, which they sprayed in the faces of people who didn't immediately comply with their orders. One was a kid who, I think it was the first time at the Haymarket. He was just a kid at the LACC. And he'd come in because he heard about the coffee house. They sprayed him in the face. And a month later, he died from respiratory condition caused by the spraying. The police never followed up this case, never charged anybody, never really investigated it. But the silver lining to this otherwise harrowing event is that John came and interviewed some of us. So I was able to meet John for the first time, and the smoldering ruins of a movement center.
And that was basically 50 years ago right now, more or less. I had just come to LA, and my ambition was to write for Liberation News Service, which was the association of underground presses that sent packets twice a week or something like that to 200 underground papers. And I was the LA stringer, and this was the big story. Actually, LA had more terrorist attacks in the late 60s than any other city in America. I think before or since. It was, I don't know exactly why, but the Cuban exile community here was extremely violent and extremely active. and they regularly attacked the offices of the Socialist Workers' Party, which was a very pro-Castro group at that time. They attacked the Ash Grove, a folk music club on Melrose. They attacked airlines offices that flew to Cuba. And they attacked this movement center where Mike was working. It's one of the forgotten episodes of life in the 60s, which, had its scary moments, I have to say.
Yeah, I really appreciated some of that history in the book. This is obviously very different, but I always remember sort of a parallel story about the sort of right-wing Venezuelan community in LA, where one of my friends, whose name is Daniel Chavez, went to give a kind of resource kind of talk, and everyone booed him just because his last name was Chavez. LA has this kind of interesting history. So I wanted to say a little bit about myself, because I don't think we haven't met, and this is strange to do things on Zoom in the age of coronavirus, but it's about myself, but in relation to the book. If anyone's home right now and you're here to see Mike and John and you could care less about me, now's the time to fast forward for a few minutes. But I really bring this up because for me, I had a lot of kind of visceral experiences when I was reading the book. And I think that others who pick it up might also have that, whether or not you're born in LA. But I happened to be born and raised in LA, in Boyle Heights. I always say I was born in Boyle Heights, but really I was born in this little community that's like smack dab between Boyle Heights and East LA. And so I was really shocked when I picked up the book and started reading it, that immediately this little area becomes politicized in the book as this kind of battleground of Latinx politics, where there's this sort of majority Latinx constituency divided into incorporated and unincorporated areas. So I'm just reading it, right, just trying to prepare for this book. And immediately I'm like, okay, this is something that's really, it's a history of the 60s, but in so many ways, the 60s is very present. There's still to this day, this sort of battle of incorporation, but it's not just that. I also grew up attending extremely racially segregated schools in Los Angeles Unified School District. And I eventually became a beneficiary of LAUSD's magnet school programs, the origins of which you discuss in this book as the struggles to create this busing program to schools throughout the city, especially the Valley. And of course, now as a graduate student in the Chicano Studies Department at UCLA, I'm I think I belong to the 5th or 6th cohort. But you talk a lot about the creation of ethnic studies programs such as Chicano studies, but also Black studies or Africana studies in the book. And it's not just for people from LA. I think this book will have resonance with national and really at times global repercussions in LA. For instance, when you discuss sort of Ronald Reagan and his relationship to the farm workers movement and things like that, you really explode the ways that what happened in LA were sort of what you called earlier underground stories. So all that to say that I think that there's a lot of points of entry to this book, and it's difficult to organize like a conversation around this sort of 600-page. I don't know if people had a chance to see this, but it's enormous, and I read as much of it as I possibly could, but there's so much. And I wanted to really think about this in terms of structure this conversation in terms of like lessons or strategies and tactics for radicals today. But then as I was corresponding with John earlier, he added that sometimes these lessons are in the form of negative examples. And I should just say also that it goes without saying that Mike and John are free to guide this conversation anywhere. And we'll also have questions from the audience. And I was really struck. I want to start, I guess, with something that struck me in an interview that you all did with Verso as the part of the book launch. You talked about the book as this kind of cautionary tale of defeat. But then earlier I spoke with John in a correspondence. He said that there might be some disagreement with Mike about that. So how is this book a book about the defeat, or is it not a book about defeat, and what's the basis of this kind of disagreement from your perspective?
Well, the argument of the book is that both the reform movements of the 60s, as for example, the 1963 Unified Civil Rights Movement in Los Angeles, which was a united front of all African-American groups, plus one of the leading Chicano organizations. Across the board, reforms in education, housing, employment, and that was defeated. Pardon me. John can talk about the 1969 campaign of Tom Bradley for mayor, which was a progressive campaign, unlike his second victorious campaign 4 years later. And the defeat of that, he was leading the polls, but he was defeated by one of the most outright, extraordinarily racist campaigns in LA history, where the incumbent mayor, the right-wing populist Sam Yorty, basically took the part of George Wallace. And so these defeats foreclosed avenues for peaceful change. More revolutionary groups whose focus was on organizing people in the streets or in the workplaces faced a regime of repression, I think almost without equal in any northern city. It was comparable to what civil rights activists faced in places like Birmingham, Alabama, for example. But while the campaigns and the individual movements at the end of the day failed to win victories, the point that we try and make in the epilogue is that memory hasn't failed these struggles. It's been transmitted, the experience, the meaning, and above all, the kind of heroic values of these movements have been transmitted by people who came of age then to their children and now to their grandchildren. And we're not talking just about nostalgic political memories like back in the day when I demonstrated at UCLA. We're talking about young people your age encountering many of the same, exactly the same conditions that were protested against in the 60s. In education, above all, where the teachers' strike with its huge community and student support a year ago was fighting over the same issues that the United Civil Rights Movement was fighting over in '63, that Black and Chicano kids in the blowouts that followed over a 2.5-year period were fighting against in their schools. And this keeps the lessons of the 60s relevant.
And I would add that while for the great majority of really the heroes of our book, the young people of color in South Central and East LA, life really did not get any better in the 70s and 80s. In fact, things probably went downhill in Watts. For the other movements, there were some successes. They didn't achieve their most ambitious goals, but certainly LA, let's remember, had the first gay street protest in America 2 years before Stonewall. There were protests against the police raid on a gay bar, the Black Cat Bar in Silver Lake. It's a historic site today. Life for gays in Los Angeles and America has obviously was transformed by the gay liberation movement. LA had the first women's self-help health clinic on South Crenshaw. It was raided by the police who arrested and put on trial activists led by Carol Downer for practicing medicine without a license. The medical treatment of women has been completely transformed since that time. It's not an unusual idea now that women should have a more active role in controlling their own bodies. And one of the most remarkable victories that took a long time was the free clinic. The free clinic of Los Angeles was the second free clinic in the United States. San Francisco came first. The idea was healthcare, free healthcare is a human right. That is at the center of American politics right now. And it was argued for the first time by these, left-wing doctors and hippie kids on Fairfax Avenue in Los Angeles starting in 1967. So there were some victories, some took a long time, and they were partial, not complete, but let's not overlook those two.
Yeah, I was really excited to see in the book a discussion of the Black Cat Tavern, because my partner and I were just watching this new Netflix documentary, Circus of Books, that's all about this queer bookstore. And they very briefly mentioned this like untold history of LA 2 years before Stonewall. And we were immediately on the lookout for more information about it. So this is another kind of really cool nugget of information that you have in there.
And if I could just point to Mike on one issue here, one of the keys to gay organizing in Los Angeles is one of the underlying themes of our book, and that is the importance of the Communist Party of Southern California as a source of organizers' experience and a place where the old left and the new left had ties that maybe didn't exist anywhere else. Mike.
The normal historiography of the 60s is that the old left and the generation of the 30s or 40s were basically irrelevant to protests and movements of the 60s. That's not the case in Los Angeles. And you find in things from Morris Kite and Harry Hay in the gay movement to people who were the key organizers of the Peace Action Council, Tart Kunken, the founder proprietor of the all-important LA Free Press, people who led consistently political lives from the late 30s, 1940s on, and were around and played key roles in facilitating movements led by younger people. And above all, the importance of American communism's one dissenting branch, the Southern California district of the Communist Party, led by one of the most remarkable figures in the movement history of LA, Dorothy Healy, who kicked out of high school when she was 16 years old, speaking on soapboxes in Oakland, rallying the unemployed, a lifetime of extraordinary organizing and accomplishments, but above all, an independent and absolutely audacious thinker. And in Southern California, there is Communist Party. Well, there are two reasons. First of all, because the Southern California district opposed the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. It supported a communist reformation. It supported Alexander Dubček and the action program, reform program of the Czech communists. I would never have joined a group that was sycophantic with the Soviet Union. And the second, in some ways more important reason, is the Communist Party, the youth branch of the Communist Party in LA, had a multiracial membership, but largely Black leadership, which no other group with multiracial membership had. And those included two that people now forgotten, but who were kind of giants in this period, Franklin and Kendra Alexander of the Che Lumumba Club. They're the people who recruited Angela Davis. I joined the Communist Party about the same, my wife and I joined the Communist Party about the same time Angela did in end of 1968.
Yeah, I mean, as a sort of woman on the left, I was really struck and this kind of nerdy point, but by the sort of the archive that you look at in terms of especially the involvement of the Communist Party in Southern California with kind of Black liberation movement, that we know these stories, but I think that you really it's almost it's a feminist history, I think, because you center in a lot of those instances the voices of folks like Dorothy Healy, but also Angela Davis, and the sources that you use, and the you're telling the story, and there's many ways to tell that story, but I thought that was really impressive, and it speaks to sort of contemporary conversations that today get called sort of the conversation around identity politics, but it's really in the 60s were articulated as debates around nationalism, separatism, and unity. I was wondering if you had any, if that was intentional for you to kind of highlight the voices of women, or if it's just, you think that that's the history.
I don't know. I think, if you look at the history of the anti-war movement in Los Angeles, it begins with Women's Strike for Peace, which was a really remarkable organization. They had huge protest marches downtown LA in 1961 against nuclear testing. They started out as a ban the bomb group. 2,000 people marched on City Hall in 1961, which is long before anybody thinks of, the anti-war movement taking shape. But it was an organization led by women. They were red baited. They were called communists, and they had an amazing spirit, a kind of a combination of being very determined but also very lighthearted. They just kind of shrugged off the thing about, yeah, there's communists. There's probably communists in our group. We don't, check people out if they want to fight against nuclear war and the Cold War. More power to them. They were investigated by Congress, and they just kind of ridiculed the committee. One of the first groups ever to try to do that. So when you're looking at the history of anti-war activism in Los Angeles, you have to look at Women's Strike for Peace. They ended up also sending the first peace movement leaders to North Vietnam at the height of the war. They met with women of the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam. They were fantastic, and they're the beginning of the story, and it was wonderful to have a chance to write about them.
Yeah, I wanted to actually earlier ask you a question about the cover. I don't know if people can see this cover, but it's this really beautiful photo. It's a photograph, and there's actually a number of really great photographs. But speaking of women, this was a photograph that I had to think very long and hard about, actually, because when you first look at it, it's obviously a really striking photograph. It's a photo, presumably, of Chicano youth during the blowouts. And you know that because you see some of the women in here wearing a brown beret with the Mexican flag on it. So you think you know the story of this photograph. And then you look closer, and they're holding a banner that says Florence Community. And if you're from LA, this might be like somewhat striking, because Florence Community is many miles south of where this supposed epicenter of the Chicano walkouts is, in East LA. And then you open the book, and the photograph is in the book as well. And the description was shocking even to me, as someone who, as a Chicano studies scholar. I think I know the story, but you actually open the book, and I think people would be surprised by the photograph. So I thought it was an interesting choice. Maybe you can talk about what we're looking at in the photograph, why I think that they might surprise people who think that they're familiar with the blowouts, both in terms of, as we said, the gender composition, but the age and the location. And then what does this signal about about what you what the story is you want to tell us about Los Angeles. Why someone who thinks that they know Los Angeles in the 60s might still benefit from a book like this.
What has been infrequently, if at all, investigated in the histories of the 60s and early 70s is what were the social forces involved. We actually know a lot about the civil rights movement in the South. There are books like a splendid book called Ordinary People, which is about the grassroots people of the voter registration struggle in Mississippi. We have detailed studies of other communities, but in the North, the 60s never been looked at from the bottom up. So one of our concerns here was to identify, well, who are the real social forces? Who are the rank and file people in LA? That's a far more important story than people who were temporarily the leader of this or that. And the thing that struck us was the role of high school and junior high school students going back to 63, but after the Watts Rebellion from 1967 to 1969, because there were not only blowouts on the east side, there were blowouts in South Central. There were big high school protests by white students in solidarity with Black and Brown. And what's so compelling to us about this photograph is that it encapsulates the real social composition of the struggle. You have high school kids here, you have junior high school kids, and they're from the Florence Firestone community, which at that point would have had about 75,000 people. And it's one of these oddities unique to LA of a heavily urbanized, older industrial working class community that's unincorporated, despite attempts like in East Los Angeles and Watts to create independent cities. It's far off the radar screen of almost anybody, and that's true today as well. Every barrio in Southern California had a movement history in the 1960s. And although our book seems formidably long, it's disappointingly short from our perspective because we were unable.
From mine too.
Well, we're unable to include San Bernardino, Pomona, Fullerton, Logan Heights in San Diego, all places, Pasadena, all places that had long protracted struggles and individual movements. So what you're getting is almost like, you know, the New York deli map where New York is 3/4 of the world and everything else is on the periphery. In a sense, we overemphasize the city of Los Angeles as well as other places that were integral to the movement in Los Angeles. Places like Southgate or Torrance, where a long, bitter battle was fought over open housing. But there's so many more stories to tell. And it was our hope in writing this, that this would facilitate younger historians and activists to investigate all these other histories and to bring the story forward into the 1970s and the 1980s.
Yeah, as I was reading it, I kept thinking about my department, which is, again, a new department, but it's interdisciplinary, and just in particular, a book by, especially on the war on poverty section, which we can talk about more in a second, how it's such a great complement to Gay Teresa Johnson's book about the kind of role of Black and Chicana women in the war on poverty. And so, like, I was thinking about that dynamic of how we need more people taking this is a really exciting book because you get sort of tidbits of the history, and then I want to see more archives and archives like the one that Professor Johnson uses that are alternative archives. But I think I expect to see scholars pick this up, or sort of lay historians pick this up and start, investigating so much more about this. So I thank you for that. We had a follow-up question from our audience actually to that, because I think they were surprised to see youth so young in these movement histories. And I think that they said that children today, when it comes to issues of civil rights and racism, people complain about children's involvement in political movements. And they said, when did this change and why? But another kind of way to put it was, how did they get these super young kids involved?
Well, John, you go ahead first.
No, I wanted to say Mike was the regional coordinator for SDS, and there was a high school SDS in Los Angeles. There was the Red Tide, a newspaper put out by high school kids. I didn't really know anything about this until I read Mike's work on this. And then we've been getting, Facebook comments saying I was a Red Tider, and I never thought anybody would be writing about us before. But Mike worked with these kids.
Years ago, and this isn't in the book, but I wrote a long article about 12 teenage riots that occurred in 1960-61 in Southern California. Starting off with an event I participated in as the end of my 8th grade year, which was the drag strip riot on Elkhorn Boulevard in San Diego. There were riots at the beach. There were other riots involving street racers. There were riots by Black kids. There were riots by Chicano kids. None of these riots, as they were called, and this is a major issue at the time, the Christian anti-communist crusade, thought this was part of a Red Chinese plot, and also said there were sex clubs associated with this teenage rebellion. This is still in the age of these incredible fears about juvenile delinquency and what were your children actually doing tonight. But in fact, they represented a spontaneous current of anti-authoritarianism. Working class kids who could see their futures clearly ahead of them, joining the army or becoming homemakers, going into factory jobs, and they rebelled against the kind of predetermined destinies. They rebelled against all the constraints and authority structures. And this might not seem significant to some people who do history, but it occurred to me that this is the real crucible out of which so much of the 60s evolved. Kids organizing themselves to resist authority, to resist the predetermination of their lives. And LA has but LA particular has a virtual unique history of high school organizing. Look at the 187 protests. Look at all the protests over the last 20 years, including the teacher strike of a year ago. High school kids play a decisive role in that. Kids are far more politicized than I think most people imagine, and they're far more capable of waging disciplined, smart struggles. College students were not the heroes of the 1960s. They may have played important roles at times. And in Los Angeles, the big schools, the big universities, were very peripheral. UCLA had one big uprising during the invasion of Cambodia. But the real center of gravity, even on the college campuses, were Southwestern, Junior College, LACC, California State University, and so on. But I'm going to ask John here to briefly talk about what was the biggest college-based insurrection of the period, and a story that so many people are unaware of and forgotten. And that's what happened at Valley State College.
Well,
yes, please, John.
I want to go back one step, one more point on high school students. teeny boppers. This is a very important concept in our book. In fact, the beginning of this book, the first part of this book that Mike wrote long before anything else was written, is the chapter on the Sunset Strip riots of the mid-60s, where the so-called teeny boppers refused to abide by the curfew, and thousands of kids, high school kids, junior high school kids, poured in from all over Southern California to fight the sheriffs on Sunset Strip on summer nights. Mike's chapter on this is one of my favorite parts of the book. It has the greatest, I still remember reading, the first time I ever read this chapter, the first sentence, "A moment in rock and roll dream time," he calls it. And it's a classic example of how very young people can be very militant. And even though the media just calls them teeny boppers, this was a protracted thing, fighting the sheriffs. You know, the sheriffs remain a huge problem. LA, maybe we should explain to the people who don't live in Los Angeles, there's the city and the county. The city is patrolled by the LAPD. The county is patrolled by the sheriffs, and the sheriffs are incredible, much more brutal and aggressive these days than the LAPD. And that was true all the way back. And for some reason, Sunset Strip was never part of the city of LA, so it was patrolled by the sheriffs. Okay, this takes us to Valley State. This is the far western end of the San Fernando Valley. Nobody, I mean, it was a new subdivisions in the mid 60s, and the university system, the state college system was expanding, built a new campus out there. Nobody ever thought that this remote new school would be the center of the biggest student protest movement in Southern California that in many ways rivaled San Francisco State and Berkeley. In 1967 and 68, the movement began as a fight for Black studies, and there was a big SDS chapter. Many national leaders of SDS came out of Valley State. The police, this is the city of LA now, were incredibly brutal. The district attorney brought 1,730 felony charges against 24 Black students who had led a sit-in at the administration building. The same thing happened at 200 campuses in the United States over the next couple of years. But nowhere in America was there as big a mass felony prosecution of Black radical students as in Los Angeles at Valley State College. It's an incredible history that hardly anyone knows, and that we're very proud to make part of our book. Let me say one other thing. Mike Davis was there for the big mass bust, where hundreds of students were arrested along with a couple of brave faculty members.
I was a married truck driver in this period, but I used to get seasonally laid off for a couple of months, which was my prime time for going to demonstrations and getting arrested. And I was there officially as a legal observer for something called the Committee to Defend the Bill of Rights, which is basically a Communist Party group. But the one memory in the last moments of my life, after I recall my children and the loves of my life, the one memory I'm certain to recall is riding on the police bus to jail, and all the girls on the police bus are singing "Hey Jude." And one of the things you discover when you join a movement, become active in the movement, is how astonishingly brave ordinary people are. And you can't experience that and then later in life claim to be pessimistic about history. I saw social miracles happen in the 1960s and the civil rights movement and beyond. And we hope to convey some sense of that to the generation today, which is making its own social miracles occur.
I actually like that question because I was politicized as a high school walkout leader. I was 13 years old. I was a student at Francisco Bravo Medical Magnet, And this was in 2006 around, what I call the Great Latinx General Strike. So I really liked the representing for the youth. And as far as Valley College, which is the story of, I think what's now called Cal State Northridge, for people who don't know, was really fascinating because it was actually the repression of Black students and the SDS, you write, that kind of created this model that would then become Chicano studies, thanks to Rudy Acuna. Yeah.
Forgive me for interrupting, but there are actually two Valley colleges. There's Valley State, the big struggle occurred, but there's also Valley College, which is a community college, and it had its own big struggles because the administration banned the formation of SDS chapter, banned the formation of a Chicano chapter, and there's also a huge free speech fight there over one of its leading faculty members. I can't recall her name, but she was one of the most beautiful poets of that period in Los Angeles, and she was accused of obscene poetry, and they tried to fire her, and there's a big defense case. There's virtually no community college that did not have a sustained struggle of one kind or another.
So we have another question from the audience, sort of related to something that I wanted to ask. So we're sort of jumping around the book, the beginning, middle, end. The book is actually in chronological order. So you start with 1960, but really, in some ways, I think you also begin with like the post 40s in some ways, right? Post 40s period. And then it's this work around the establishment of ethnic studies isn't until much later in the book itself, in the late 60s. Someone's asking, sort of what did unemployment or the unemployment population look like in LA in the 60s? So you do actually talk about this a lot in the beginning. You talk about a report by an individual who was Paul something,
Bullock.
Paul Bullock, who was at UCLA, and you talk about this report that, we think about today, all kinds of reports are done on the labor situation, but I think this one really, really captured my imagination because it did a few beautiful things. Some of it was the quantitative things, obviously, but then the qualitative, like ethnographic work on where he interviewed a number of people who were participants in the Watts riots and asked them, what are the conditions that created the Watts riot? What kind of what did your participation look like? And I think this is sort of related to this question about that someone's asking in the audience about what did unemployment populations look like in the 60s? Do you discuss surplus populations? And what role did population and national movements play at the time? And I think you do a really, really wonderful job of talking about this. So I don't know if you can talk about like some of the earlier work in the book framing the situation.
Well, you have to remember. Oh, you don't have to remember. Who remembers is because somebody as old as I am. But the images that were popularized about Southern California in the 60s, the images of endless summer, the kids at the beach, Gidget at the seashore, there's some truth to that. I graduated from a white working class high school in 1964. And I think we all believed to some extent, until the Vietnam War snatched most people up in its claws, that we were kind of living on the edge of utopia. I come from a white blue collar family, and from my graph card when I was 1A, and they ended up not prosecuting me. So I was free and clear, unlike most of my friends. I could literally get up in the morning and say, do I want to be a truck driver, a warehouseman, an auto worker, a rubber worker tomorrow morning? There just seemed to be endless jobs available. At this very same time, during the Kennedy-Johnson boom, unemployment was increasing, almost double in South Central LA, particularly in Watts. The most important department or group of people at UCLA were the Institute of Industrial Relations, a bunch of left-wing New Dealers who acted as kind of the educational extension to the LA labor movement. They're now, of course, the labor studies program at UCLA. And they had remarkable people like Art Carstens, who was candidate for Congress, almost won a congressional seat in the Valley, opposing pro-war Democrats. But above all, Paul Bullock, who spent his time researching hardcore unemployment and its causes in both East LA and South Central LA. And he revealed these patterns of increasing unemployment in communities of color at the very same time that unemployment virtually disappeared in white blue-collar communities. He later, after the Watts Rebellion, was the facilitator of a book called The People of Watts Speak, in which his role is simply to collect testimony and edit it, but the voice of the people himself. He later committed suicide, partially in disparate conditions in South Central LA. If you want to ask why the Watts Rebellion happened, there's three key reasons. First of all, declining opportunity at the very same time that opportunities for working class white kids were expanding everywhere in California. A second reason was the repeal of California's open housing law, the so-called Rumford Law. Brian Rumford was a pioneer of civil rights in the Bay Area and a member of the legislature. And the legislature passed a bill at a time when African Americans had access to probably less than 2 or 3% of available rental and for purchase housing in California. White voters in the fall of 1964, by a vote of about 75% of white voters, voted down this law, repealed it. Courts later upheld it. But this is more than a slap in the face of Black people and other people of color. It seemed to show that reform was impossible. And if reforms were won, they would be repealed. And third, of course, was the LAPD. And an event that's never discussed in any of the periodic returns to the events of 1965. A young Black woman had been picked up the police, raped, and then later, after revealing the rape, which was only covered in by the two Black newspapers, the Sentinel and California Eagle, died under mysterious circumstances. And this happened a few months before the rebellion. And it's a bit, for anybody who remembers or is studied in 1992, it's a bit like the murder of Latasha Harlins, 15-year-old Black girl who was killed by a shop owner, just simply, simply murdered. That for so many people in the community, that was more important than Rodney King. And the incident that occurred that actually sparked the riot, drunk driving arrest, where the LAPD arrived and immediately started beating people in the crowd. That was only, that final molecule, that small event that detonated accumulated grievances, the most recent of which was the case of this woman, which the LA Times never reported. Nobody ever factored it in as a major cause of the rebellion, but it was in everybody's minds in August 1965.
And if I could just add one thing about August 1965, the Watts Uprising, our account of it here contains a wonderful day by day diary by Mike of his firsthand experiences and observations being on the streets of Watts during the riot and charting the different forms that action took as it changed from day to day. To me, that's one of the most unique and valuable parts of this book is Mike's diary of the Watts riots.
I wasn't actually in Watts. I was in the curfew area with the guy who became always my older brother and who taught me Los Angeles in a way that nobody else could have. His name was Levi Kingston. He died 2 months ago. He's one of the most heroic community organizers in LA history. And we're walking down the street, not too far from the SC campus, when somebody took a pot shot at him or at us. It was unclear. The first couple of nights of the so-called riot were actually quite exuberant. I was down on Vermont near what's now Martin Luther King, where there were a lot of poor white people living. It was also the center, the German part of Los Angeles in those days, watching multiracial crowds looting appliance stores and so on. And the rebellion was a godsend for me because I was trying to keep a fledgling SDS regional office together. And we didn't have a typewriter. I desperately needed a selectric typewriter. And you could just go out in the street and tell somebody, hey, I need a typewriter. Here's $20. So we got typewriters.
Yeah, I agree. This is one of the most incredible parts of the book. And you mentioned something that I think for millennials like myself, I think it might be useful to say there's a trigger warning. And there's a lot of the information that you present is sort of triggering, including this untold history that you're telling of this young woman who was raped by the police, and the sort of experience that had on the community that ended up sort of rising up in the Watts riot. And that when I was speaking to John, I was like, no, this is like this romantic, the 60s. I have, as a young radical, I have all this sort of romantic nostalgia about it. But the reality is that there were some sections of the book that I sort of like, including that one, that I sort of needed to skim through because I think they're really sensitive and sort of violent and graphic, but important parts of the history. One of the other things that you mentioned that I wanted to piggyback on, sort of unrelated, but you talked about the Rumford Law and what ended up becoming like one of the catalysts behind Proposition 14. So this right-wing backlash. So the book, in one of the earlier chapters, you're talking about housing. I'm bringing up housing because I've been involved in sort of anti-gentrification struggles. And I know right now sort of housing and struggles related to, right, there's a lot of kind of, the left is interested in labor movements, but there's a kind of move in the contemporary social movements to really think about housing struggles and the figure of the tenant as a kind of revolutionary or radical figure. And one of the things that struck me about the origins of this history in the 60s was definitely that it wasn't just about unemployment, but also what you call the issue of issues, which is racial segregation. And we talked a little bit about education, but also housing. And I guess I wanted to hear you talk a little bit more about the ways that organizers use tactics and strategies that were in conversation, borrowed from, built upon the South, like Southern desegregation movements, and then translated to a Northern or in this case, like West Coast context around housing. So right now we have, when the coronavirus started, the LA Tenants Union started a campaign to reclaim homes in the neighborhood of El Sereno in LA. And I was really interested to see that some of that has this like longer history in LA in terms of the early 60s. So I was wondering if you could kind of give housing activists out there watching this some thoughts about the housing struggle.
Well, we need to recall that housing segregation was legal in California. The California Supreme Court on several occasions upheld the right of residential communities to put in the covenants, which are the rules that you have to follow if you buy a house, about maintaining your house and so on, that they could put into these covenants restrictions on who could purchase a house. In some communities like La Jolla, I'm speaking from San Diego right now, it was Jews. But generally it was African Americans, and that was upheld. Finally, the US Supreme Court, after a long battle by the civil rights movement in the late 40s in Los Angeles, ruled that restricted covenants were illegal. They in fact continued, and housing segregation actually increased in the 1950s. Basically all the suburbs in the burgeoning parts of the city, like the San Fernando Valley, or in the southeast LA County on the west side, Black people couldn't buy homes. And Chicanos were judged mainly by their appearance. If you were at all brown skin, you couldn't buy a house either. And the Rumford Bill was an attempt to redress that, though it did not apply to small landlords, I think, with tenants of 5 or less, but it applied certainly to developers. It was not a complete equal housing bill by any stretch of the imagination. And the backlash against it was terrific. Now, in the book, when we discuss agencies and social groups, one group which plays a crucial role again and again are realtors in California. It's the California Real Estate Association that organized and defended housing segregation. And I remember vividly in my last year of high school, being a member of the Congress of Racial Equality in San Diego, a big demonstration we had at the convention of California Realtors. They were the actual architects of the repeal of Prop 14. And certainly one of the most reactionary forces in California as a whole. It's important to recognize who are the actors on the other side, who are the defenders of segregation, who are the defenders of inequality. And that, of course, even extended into the labor movement to some degree. The machinists union in the aerospace industry was basically a white supremacist union. Well, the auto workers industry, which had very progressive leadership, was a tribune of integration and a major supporter of community struggles on both the Black and South side. But the institutional complex, the interest groups and the actors defending racial inequality, very, very broad cross-section in California then, as they remain today, although more, less visibly. I don't think anybody's out there actually organizing a white citizens council right now in the way that it was done in the mid-1960s. But so many of those same forces survive and continue the battle against equality in one form or another.
And one of the histories that we tell that's very little known is the direct action, nonviolent tactics of a very big housing integration movement in Southern California in, you rightly called it, the early 60s. These new massive subdivisions would open in places like Torrance. Bean fields would have been plowed up and hundreds of houses built, all restricted to white buyers. There would not just be picket lines, but building occupations of the sample homes by young activists who would sit in for days in protest against the restrictive covenants. This was a huge part of the direct action tactics, in part learned from the South. Put your bodies on the line to demonstrate the seriousness of your commitments and the importance of the issue that you were challenging. And these are some of the young heroes of our book, and the proposition, with the passage of Proposition 14, completely, ended that kind of direct action, nonviolent protest to win the desegregation of housing. And Mike rightly says, and the Watts riots followed a year after that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned this earlier, but a lot of the earlier chapters, you're telling a story about the impossibility of these kinds of nonviolent, or what activism at the time perceived to be, or maybe really were, the impossibilities of kind of reform movements, both in housing, but you also mentioned some of these school desegregation campaigns. And someone in the audience said that they wish that they had this book 10 years ago while organizing against education budget cuts, and they're happy that the next generation will have this. And I would say that that's the case, I think, not just for around the education question, but around housing as well. And then towards the middle of the book, you really pivot towards the middle of the 60s, a moment that's characterized by, the murder of Martin Luther King, the murder also of Bobby Kennedy. And there's a struggle at some point of the left, both the left wing of the Democratic Party and, the new left, to sort of engage or non-engage with the Democratic Party. And I think that's also something that people today who are thinking through the Bernie Sanders campaign, what was once Michael Harrington's organization, the Democratic Socialists of America, but has been like a center that's really attracted this kind of millennial style socialism. So can you walk us through what that collaboration and dirty break and the creation of this third party, the Peace and Freedom Party, kind of looked like?
We're talking here about 1968, and the Vietnam War is reaching a peak in terms of 500,000 American soldiers are fighting there. No signs that the White House is right, that there's light at the end of the tunnel. There's a very big progressive reform faction in the California Democratic Party, which had been in existence for more than a decade, the California Democratic Councils. Their strategy of how to end the war in Vietnam was to challenge the incumbent president, Lyndon Johnson, in the primaries with an anti-war candidate. There were other more radical people like me and Mike at the time who said, the Democratic Party got us into this war. It's their war. There aren't enough primaries to get LBJ out. We need to challenge the entire Democratic Party with a third party. These forces organized the Peace and Freedom Party, one of the more remarkable political formations of the 60s. And it's very difficult in California to get a new party on the ballot. It requires thousands and thousands of people to sign petitions as members of this party to get a ballot line. And one of the biggest organizing campaigns in LA in the 60s was the effort to get the Peace and Freedom Party on the ballot in the 1968 presidential election. It succeeded. It was the first time there was a new third party in California since the Progressive Party of 1948. And it was very important. Also, the Black Power movement, the Black radical movement, was also extremely important in California, with the Black Panther Party based in Oakland. And it was very important to white radicals that this would not be a white party. This had to be an interracial party. So Peace and Freedom formed an alliance with the Black Panther Party that they would run leaders of the Panthers for some offices and white people for other offices. And a deal was cut with between the Peace and Freedom Party and the Black Panther Party that Eldridge Cleaver, who was I think he was called what? Minister of Information for the Black Panther Party, would be the presidential candidate of the Peace and Freedom Party in California. Eldridge, however, was not old enough to be president. You have to be 35. It's in the Constitution. And so he was ruled off the ballot. This was fought all the way to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court said the Constitution is clear on this. So kind of the heart went out of the campaign of the Peace and Freedom Party. In the meantime, the liberal Democrats had two candidates. Many older watchers will remember Eugene McCarthy and Bobby Kennedy, both anti-war senators, both competing in California with very different social forces behind them. It was the night of the California primary, when the votes were being counted, that Bobby Kennedy was assassinated at the Ambassador Hotel in New York. And that kind of put an end to that struggle. So Hubert Humphrey went on to take over the nomination. LBJ had meanwhile withdrawn from the race after seeing how poorly he was doing in the very first primaries. And Nixon was elected. It was one of the greatest defeats of the 60s. Bernie Sanders has taken a different route. Bernie Sanders decided to fight this fight within the Democratic Party, but there's been one big difference in the Democratic Party, which is there's a whole lot more primaries 4 years ago and this year than there were in 1968. In 1968, Hubert Humphrey won the nomination without winning a single primary. That would be impossible today. The Democratic Party was then reformed in 1972 by the McGovern forces. But Bernie is really the first democratic socialist to campaign inside the Democratic Party as a socialist for the presidential nomination, won millions of votes, built a huge movement. And that's one way in which the present progressive movement is made tremendous strides, it's done much better than the electoral politics of the anti-war movement in 1968.
Yeah, can I just point out that one of the photos in the book is this great campaign photo. It's Eldridge Cleaver for president, power to the people, Black power to Black people. He got virtually no votes in California. And he was also, you talk about in the campaign speeches, he went and talked about something called pussy power. So he kind of was treated as a joke in those campaigns, but you're talking about it as like a kind of missed opportunity. You talk about it as a important like missed opportunity for the creation of a real third party in this country, because they made a strategic decision to partner with the Black Panthers, and which in this case meant having Cleaver as the spokesperson.
I mean, Eldridge had been a very important person, not just in Black America, but in mainstream America. His book, Soul on Ice, was a bestseller, was proclaimed by the New York Times as the most important book by a Black author since the autobiography of Malcolm X. He was a problematic figure, let us say, and he clearly lost heart when he was ruled off the ballot. I don't know, Mike, you were there. What's your perspective on Eldridge?
After the siege of the Black Panther Party headquarters, there was a demonstration downtown in front of the courthouse. It was unlike any demonstration I participated in the 1960s, because thousands of kids from South Central appeared. Kids you never see downtown or in other parts of the cities. Kids who people thought were unreachable in terms of political organizing, and they were all there. The Black Panther Party had a moment in history where it could have flourished and grown in amazing ways. My best friend and I were working with a group of young Black Panthers at Terminal Annex. At that point was the Central Post Office, Los Angeles. These guys were all young veterans returned, and they'd formed a Black Panther chapter in the post office. There's a big Black Panther chapter in the Fremont Works of General Motors in the Bay Area. And it's precisely at that moment that the leadership of the party fell into vituperation that turned into, some cases, murder. A homicidal fury that, of course, we know was instigated and by the FBI and its COINTEL program, but also exposed faults in the party leadership, in the lack of democracy inside the party, and with a kind of schizophrenic ideology that on one hand celebrated armed struggle and revolution, but on the other was engaged in kind of war and poverty activities like feeding children, which was a great thing to do. It was tremendously popular, but the party never found a politics to allow it to negotiate between the extremes. And it lacked an individual capable of standing up in the middle of fratricide and saying, we're being manipulated, we're being used, which is why for many people who lived through that period would defer to the experience of Detroit and the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, which was solidly rooted in the factories, a young Black working class organization with a Marxist perspective. That might have happened in the Panther Party too, given time. There were people like, perhaps known in aficionado as a Black Panther history as Field Marshal Massey, Ray Hewitt, who I used to have arguments all the time, because for a brief period I ran the Communist Party bookstore, and Ray would come in. And this is a guy who was completely self-educated, and usually he'd beat me down in debates about socialism and Marxist theory. He was a person of incredible competence and self-learning, but people like him were marginalized. And you cannot underestimate the damage done by a combined effort of the FBI, the COINTEL program, the LAPD, the LA sheriffs, and one of the most evil figures in LA history, who was Attorney General Evel Younger, or later Attorney General Evel Younger. He was District Attorney of Los Angeles in the late 60s, early 70s. And John can talk a little bit about, because he was involved in LA State, but everywhere he went, he liked to indict people on endless numbers of felony counts, because he realized it paralyzed and crippled movements to do that. And it was the combination of these four agencies that made life a nightmare for people, and also distracted us from attacking the real centers of power, which, for instance, the Congress of Racial Equality in the 1963 struggle in the city of Torrance over open housing that John talked about, CORE began to demonstrate against the home savings and loan firms that financed segregated housing. There were other attempts to get at the actual ruling figures and behind Los Angeles politics, but the police, and the whole repressive establishment ended up making us focus most of our time on defense committees rather than, aggressive campaigns that expose the real nature of power and authority in Los Angeles.
Actually, someone just asked a question in the audience. When is Mike going to write a new history of CORE, a grassroots history of the national reverberations of the civil rights movement? I think this is throughout the book, but someone said this, there's only bursts through this pages. I think that means that you have to write that book. No, I don't know. And then sort of related, someone's asked that they're really interested in this question of the South vis-a-vis California, how to compare and contrast the general strategies of California, communist and socialist groups, to those other segments of the civil rights movement in Southern states. But I would say that I another way to ask this question too is that I think that one of the things that you're trying to describe in this book is that some of, you know, there wasn't like a civil rights movement or Black liberation movement in the South, and then like LA was peripheral, because some of the kind of history that you're describing with the Black Congress is taking place in California. And then obviously we know the Black Panthers were in the Bay, but in LA, I think some of this unfolds in a way that has like repercussions that are national repercussions that we might not think about.
1963 is the year to start with, because the largest and most epic single mass civil rights movement and the whole period was conducted in Birmingham, Alabama, against one of the most powerful and evil local ruling classes in the South, led by a figure who's often overlooked in civil rights history, but in my mind, epitomizes almost a kind of suicidal bravery and dedication to the cause, Fred Shuttlesworth, who led the movement in Birmingham. And the Birmingham movement called upon civil rights groups throughout the country to come to its aid. But as these support committees grew in size, increasingly they adopted the strategy not only supporting the Southern struggle, but taking the Southern struggle north with the same kinds of demands, with education and housing and public space being the kind of means to the final end, which was always employment. This was the real issue, was equal in employment. Everything else, in a way, was part of the means to achieve that goal. And in Detroit and Los Angeles, you had these huge civic coalitions, the most advanced of which was in Detroit, where 150,000 people turned out in a single march, a massive flexing of strength by Black working class community in Detroit. But as in Los Angeles, both movements were defeated. And if you want to understand the Detroit riot of 1967, you have to go back to 1963. The Black Congress emerged out of the unity forged by the rebellion in August 65. And John should say something about the so-called Watts Renaissance, because the most important cultural movement really of the 60s in Los Angeles occurred in the Black community right after the rebellion. But it also led to the creation of something called the Black Congress, which was the united front of all the Black radical groups in the city. Ron Karenga's US organization, the Panthers were soon added to it, Che Lumumba Club, all kinds of local groups. They had a headquarters. And that unity was destroyed again by the infiltration of FBI informers and a flat-out campaign to convince the Panthers that Karenga was out to kill them, and to convince Ron Karenga, the leading cultural nationalist in the city, that the Panthers were out to kill him. And it ended up with the notorious shootout in Campbell Hall at UCLA, where two leaders of the Black Panther Party, John Huggins and Al Prentice Bunchy Carter, were murdered. Carter's death was particularly a tragedy because he'd been the key peacemaker, the intermediary between his Black Panther Party chapter and the US organization. But Black unity was destroyed as the result of that event, and ended up becoming a small fratricidal civil war throughout Southern California. John, the Watts
was there any-
Renaissance?
Well, one of the most striking parts of this entire history is that the Watts riots, the Watts uprising, the Watts rebellion was followed by a tremendous cultural flowering in South Central Los Angeles. It took two particularly memorable forms: the free jazz movement around Horace Tapscott. They played at all kinds of movement fundraisers and became nationally prominent. And second, a kind of art assemblage, it would be called today, sculptural movement of people who started out picking up trash after the ruins of the fires of the Watts riots, and making sculptures out of them. This is now a much honored movement in the history of art in Los Angeles. They have their own exhibits, the collections, but nobody really imagined that there would be a flowering of these avant-garde arts. And then, of course, there was the Watts Writers Workshop, which was another striking phenomenon led by Hollywood screenwriter Bud Schulberg. So on all these fronts, the written word, music, the plastic arts, Watts had a great cultural flowering in the post-65 period, which remains today at the center of the cultural history of the city.
And if I might just insert a bibliographical note here. So much of the period we're talking about essentially unstudied, but the Watts Renaissance has been well studied. And there are two magnificent, really brilliant histories of it. One is by Steve Iswardi, focusing on Horace Tapscott's orchestra and the musical component of the Renaissance. Another, a broader picture of the entire spectrum of cultural activity, is by Dan Widener. And if anybody's interested in this, these are two commanding books that you must read or look at some point.
Always appreciate book recommendations from Mike Davis. I think that this kind of brings us to up until the later work that you describe in the book, in the kind of late 60s and early 70s. I felt bamboozled because it's supposed to be a book about the 60s. Now I have to learn about the 70s too. And someone asked, how does this history coincide with the living struggles in LA today? You all spent your lives studying LA. Given how much of your lives are here, how do you hope that workers and proletarian social movements receive or the Set the Night on Fire, or what can they do with it? That's a question I had too.
Well, I have two Mexican children who go to an inner city high school, San Diego High. The generation are lions, just as were the kids in the 60s, as were the kids in the big movement for immigration rights, the kids in the anti-187 campaign 20-some years ago. And they want to fight, okay? They understand that the future is being stolen from them. They see the recrudescence of racism and hatred and bigotry on all sides. This is a fighting generation. And I have the greatest optimism, but they need support. They need it. That's one of the purposes of writing the books, is trying to convince people that, look, these kids that you dismiss as being too young or too trivial were, in fact, I might use the impression, the kind of Bolsheviks of the 1960s. And again, just like the 1930s. It was the Young Communist League that Dorothy Healy grew up in the late 1920s, early 1930s. They were kind of crazy in some ways. They had really extreme left positions, but they had courage and fighting spirit and wanted to be at the front of the struggle wherever it was. And if there ever is a time in American history where that same kind of fighting spirit, combativeness, rage can be channeled to saving the lives of ordinary folks, it's right now. And I have tremendous optimism.
That's a compliment to our generation and I guess the Generation Z that's following us. John, did you have something to add to that?
Well, I just want to say that we pay tribute at the end of our book to the LA teachers strike of last year. Really a great step forward compared to what was going on in the 60s. In the 60s, there were students protesting against segregated schools, against inadequate classrooms, against the curriculum. But the teachers were opposed to the student strike. What was new this time was that the teachers, the parents, and the kids manned the picket lines everywhere in Los Angeles for a couple of weeks. It was a tremendously inspiring thing, and it really was a lot better form of popular struggle than what we saw around schools in the 60s. And that also gives us a lot of hope for the future, that the labor movement, especially the teachers union, has been transformed. It's been, of course, it's the young teachers of color who were kids or whose grandparents were around in the 60s that were part of this struggle. But that's another way that we're much more optimistic now than people were in the 60s.
I'm really glad you brought up the teacher strike because I was there last year and I was able to interview a number of teachers and community members, as you're saying, that were, all on the picket line, sort of indiscriminately. And I think that LA, and I'm an LA snob, but I think that LA really had a clear articulation about the relationship between like neoliberal attacks on the schools and questions of race. I think more so than some of the other cities that we were seeing. And I was kind of questioning, well, why is LA here now? Why are they leading? And in a similar way that Chicago sort of articulated that years before, but it made me sort of prideful about being an LAUSD product in that sense. So I'm out of questions for you, but I think that there's a million things that we didn't talk about that we could sit here for hours and talk about them. So I want to give you the chance to, have closing comments. Is there something sort of huge that I missed about the book that you want to let people know?
John?
Well, I just want to thank you, Maga, first of all, for reading this very, very long book, a too long book, and for doing such a great job of leading this discussion. You're really good at this, and you're a lot younger than we are, so we appreciate that too. So thanks to you, and thanks to Philip and Red May for giving us this opportunity.
I second that, and just wanted to say, it's like one evening in March, we all went to sleep. And when we woke up in the morning and looked outside the door, it was 1933 again. And I think we understand that there's no chance of things returning to the way they were. That we're in a new historical epoch where things like mass immiseration are returning to the United States. Hunger is already stalking people in working class communities across the country. And as much as I support Bernie Sanders and recently given my $27 to support the congressional candidates, I think that progressive politics is far too inside the Democratic Party at this point. which is not to support progressive Democrats, but there's the labor rebellion breaking out. We saw that on May Day. There are communities of color who do not accept the fact that they have to make trade-offs between going back to work to save their home, but then possibly coming home from work and infecting their grandmother or grandfather in the same household. Working class Americans are confronted with evil, absolutely unnecessary choices. They see their futures disappearing. And what we need, first of all, is to get ourselves into an emotional place where we understand that discipline, rage, and anger and militancy are the rations we need to carry ourselves forward on this long journey into the kind of dark age that lays before us. Thank you again so much.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm glad you brought in the coronavirus. I was trying to figure out how to work that in and the struggles, but you did that fantastic job. And so before we end, I want to kick it over to Phil. Thank you again so much to Mike and John. And again, this is now available with Verso Books, and they're having a sale now for Red May, 50% off. It's well worth it. And I'll kick it over to Phil. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mega, for moderating this. And thank you, Mike and John. It's nice to see people my age who only get radical as they get older. I have to say, of course, it was a magical mystery tour for me to go back to moments of the 60s. I won't bore you with the stops on my personal itinerary here, but when one thing John mentioned kicked off something. If you walk into strip malls now, you'll notice businesses called Zoom Care or Urgent Care. These are kind of boutique emergency medical places that probably cost about 5 times as much, cost somebody 5 times as much as ordinary hospitals do. And it makes you think that the notion of these free clinics, which were all around in the 60s, the country doctor and so forth, that I put my 22-year-old body in as I was wandering on the road, and nothing seemed remarkable to me about it, because one would think that the notion of mutual aid was in the air as opposed to being an entrepreneur of the self. But every time I look at those, I think, my God, how did that happen? But we know, looking at the coronavirus and the resuscitation of mutual aid, that those things can happen again. We just have to fight for them. So again, thanks very much. I now got to do some quick pitches for money, and also to alert you on the program. Tomorrow, again, Capital is Dead, 5 p.m. This is something worse. Mackenzie Warwick's book. Responses from Alexander Zevin, Jasper Burns, Wendy Lewis, moderator. The book, by the way, is available from Verso at 50% off. Thursday night, May 14th at 6 p.m., A Climate Crisis Through a Pandemic Lens. Theo Franco's Nick Estes, Holly Jean Buck, and Jeff Mann give their particular perspectives on the climate crisis. Olufemi Taiwo is the moderator. On Friday night at 5 p.m., Racial Capitalism and Disposable Populations in the Time of COVID-19. Chris Chen, Idris Robinson, John Clegg, Eco Day, Shailene Rodriguez, Sarika Chandra. Just found out that Chris Nealon is moderating, so that should be terrific. Now on the money, just go down to the Red May YouTube page. You'll see something that says donate on it. Click, give what you can. We need your money to keep going. We have no institutional support. Thanks a lot. We'll see you tomorrow. And thanks again, everybody.